John Wayne walked into a White House dinner in 1973, and Richard Nixon, the most powerful man in the world, stood to greet him. Every person in that room, senators with decades of political power, generals who commanded armies, cabinet members who shaped national policy, all of them stood with Nixon. Not because protocol demanded it, not because some official announcement told them to rise, but because something in their DNA, something older than conscious thought, something that operates in the primitive survival centers of the human brain, told them that when this particular man entered a room, you stood. This wasn't respect for an actor or a celebrity. This was something primal, something ancient, something that happens in the first 3 seconds before your conscious mind even registers what's occurring. When certain men walk into a space, every other man in that space unconsciously calculates dominance, threat level, and hierarchy. And John Wayne never lost that calculation, not once in his entire life, not in a single room he ever entered. Psychologists have a name for this phenomenon now. They call it old-school alpha, a specific type of masculine energy that has nothing to do with modern alpha male culture, nothing to do with loud displays or peacocking or aggressive posturing. This is something quieter, more absolute, more unchallengeable. It's combined with what researchers call Patriarch, the protector archetype that's hardwired into human biology going back 200,000 years, the energy that makes women relax and children feel safe and other men unconsciously orient themselves toward it. And layered on top of both of these is something uniquely American, what sociologists call American myth, the larger-than-life narrative that transcends the individual and becomes a cultural force that shapes entire generations. When all three of these elements exist in one man simultaneously, he doesn't just command a room. He commands a generation, a culture, an entire understanding of what masculinity means and what strength looks like and what it means to be a man in America. This isn't about toxic masculinity or outdated gender roles, or some nostalgic longing for a past that never existed. This is about an energy so powerful that it shaped American identity for half a century. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Ronald Reagan, men who carried this exact combination of traits, men whose very presence changed the temperature of every space they occupied. And whether we admit it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not, their presence still echoes through every definition of strength we hold today, every unconscious assumption about what male leadership looks like, every instinctive response we have when we're trying to determine who to follow in a crisis. But here is what makes this aura truly unsettling, what makes it worth understanding even if we've moved beyond it culturally. The men who carried it most powerfully were often playing a role. John Wayne's real name was Marion Morrison. He never served in the military, never fought in a war, never did any of the things that his characters did on screen. Yet, he became the definition of American manhood for 3 generations. The myth became more real than reality itself, and that transformation from man to myth reveals something about human nature that we still struggle to fully understand. In 1978, a sociologist at UCLA conducted a study on masculine archetypes. They showed photographs of 50 different men to over 2,000 participants from every demographic background. Asked them one simple question: who would you follow into battle? No context, no biography, just the photographs and that one question. John Wayne's photograph, despite him being 71 years old at the time and visibly dying of cancer, won by a margin so overwhelming that researchers initially thought their data was corrupted. They ran the study again with a different sample. Same result. Then they did something that revealed the true power of myth over reality. They told half the participants that John Wayne had never actually served in combat, that every battle they remembered him fighting was fictional, that he was an actor who played soldiers but never was one. Then they asked the question again. The responses didn't change. People said they would still follow him into battle because somehow, impossibly, the truth didn't matter. The myth was more powerful than the man. The archetype was more real than the reality. And that tells us something profound about human psychology, about the stories we need to believe, and about why certain energies transcend facts and become forces that shape entire cultures. If this idea of a masculine energy so powerful it shaped an entire nation's identity already has you questioning everything you thought you knew about strength, Hit that subscribe button for Emma's Theater right now because we are about to break down exactly what this archetype is, why it worked, and whether it still exists today. We bring you the stories behind the myths that built America. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever met a man whose presence made every other man in the room instinctively defer to him? Not through aggression, but through something older and more fundamental? Share that story. I read every single comment. The old-school alpha component of this archetype has absolutely nothing to do with what modern internet culture calls alpha male behavior. No chest puffing, no loud dominance displays, no constant need to prove superiority or establish hierarchy through conflict. Old-school alpha is quiet, absolute, and unchallengeable in a way that modern masculinity can barely comprehend because we've lost the template for what it actually looked like. John Wayne stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and moved slowly, spoke slowly, never rushed a single word or gesture in his entire career. He never flinched, never explained himself, never defended his choices to anyone. His body language communicated a simple message that every nervous system in proximity could feel. I am the center of gravity in this room. Not through aggression, not through threat, simply through existence. And that existence was sufficient. The biology behind this goes deeper than simple testosterone expression. Cortisol regulation, the body's stress hormone system, matters far more than raw hormonal dominance. Men with true alpha presence, the kind that John Wayne radiated effortlessly, have remarkably low stress responses. They don't react to threats with visible agitation or defensive posturing because very little actually threatens them at a fundamental level. Their nervous systems remain calm in situations where other men's bodies flood with fight-or-flight chemicals. This is why it's called old-school alpha. Modern masculinity is performative, reactive, fundamentally insecure. It performs dominance because it doesn't actually possess it. Old-school alpha never performs because it has nothing to prove. It simply exists, and that existence is sufficient, the same way a mountain doesn't argue that it's a mountain. The patriarch component is the most misunderstood element in all of modern discourse about masculinity. When we hear patriarch today, we think oppressor, dominator, controller. But that's a fundamental misreading of what the archetype actually represented. Patriarch means protector, provider, the one who bears the burden so others don't have to. The evolutionary foundation for this goes back 200,000 years of human survival. Every successful human tribe required someone willing to stand between the group and danger. Not the strongest person, not the smartest, but the one whose nervous system could remain calm in chaos, whose presence created safety through sheer steadiness. That person led not through force, but through the biological response they triggered in others. When you encountered someone whose internal state remained unshakable regardless of external threat, your own nervous system registered that as trustworthy at the deepest possible level. Women and children relaxed around this energy instinctively. Other men oriented toward it unconsciously. Because 200,000 years of evolution had taught every human nervous system the same lesson. That man will protect us. That man can bear what we cannot. That man stands between us and chaos. John Wayne perfected this archetype across 142 films, playing essentially the same character over and over. The reluctant hero who doesn't seek violence, but is absolutely capable of it when protection requires it. The man who defends the weak, punishes the wicked, restores order to chaos, and then rides off into the sunset because the job is done and he requires no recognition for doing what was simply necessary. America watched this exact pattern repeat itself 150 times across 4 decades and absorbed it as the masculine ideal, the template for what men were supposed to be. And that absorption happened not through conscious learning, but through the same biological mechanism that tribal humans used to identify protectors. The nervous system recognized the pattern before the conscious mind understood what it was seeing. The American myth component is what elevated individual men into cultural forces that transcended their actual identities. American myth took the frontier narrative, the lone man taming wilderness and bringing civilization to chaos, and added manifest destiny, the idea that expansion was not just practical, but morally righteous. It combined this with Judeo-Christian morality that saw the world in clear terms of good versus evil with no ambiguous middle ground. The result was a masculine ideal that was strong but moral, independent but protective, capable of violence, but only in service of justice. Before cinema, building myths like this took generations. George Washington became mythological over decades of storytelling. Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone required lifetimes to transform from men into legends. But film compressed myth-building from centuries into years. John Wayne made 142 films playing essentially the same archetypal character, and by the time he died, he was that character to most Americans. The distinction between Marion Morrison the man and John Wayne the myth had completely dissolved. People didn't see an actor anymore. They saw the embodiment of American masculine virtue, and that perception shaped behavior, politics, and cultural identity in ways we're still unraveling today. Each component alone creates interesting men, but the combination of all three simultaneously creates something that transcends individual identity and becomes a cultural force. Old-school alpha without patriarch becomes tyranny, raw dominance without purpose or protection. You get men who command rooms but serve only themselves, who create fear rather than safety. Patriarch without American myth stays local and personal, never becoming legendary or culturally transformative. You get good fathers and community leaders who protect their immediate circles but never shape broader culture. American myth without old-school alpha becomes hollow caricature, all performance and no substance. You get actors playing roles that everyone recognizes as fiction. All three together, however, create something that operates on an almost supernatural level. A presence that changes not just individual rooms, but entire generations, that becomes the template against which all other expressions of masculinity are measured. And understanding why this archetype dominated American culture from the 1930s through the 1970s requires understanding the historical context that created the desperate need for exactly this kind of myth. The Great Depression hit America in 1929 and shattered every assumption about progress, prosperity, and masculine capability. Millions of men who had defined themselves through their ability to provide for their families suddenly couldn't. The fundamental promise of American masculinity, that hard work guarantees success, that strength ensures survival, collapsed completely. The nation needed reassurance that strong men still existed, that protection was still possible, that order could be restored from chaos. John Wayne's early films in the 1930s sold exactly this promise. His characters were men who could not be broken by circumstances, who remained unshakable when everything around them fell apart, who restored order through sheer force of presence and moral clarity. This wasn't entertainment. It was therapy for a traumatized nation. Then came World War II, and the myth became even more essential. Real war required mythologizing to sustain morale, to make the horror bearable, to give meaning to the sacrifice. John Wayne didn't serve in the military. He was 34 when Pearl Harbor happened, prime fighting age, and he stayed in Hollywood making war films while contemporaries like Jimmy Stewart and Clark Gable enlisted and fought. But his films became the war for Americans at home. They showed war as noble, clear, winnable. The myth served a function that reality couldn't fulfill. It made the unbearable feel heroic. The 1950s brought post-war anxiety, nuclear threat, and Cold War paranoia. Men were returning from combat with trauma they couldn't discuss and uncertainty about their place in a rapidly changing world. John Wayne's films offered moral clarity in a morally complex world. Good guys wore white hats, bad guys wore black. Justice always prevailed. Strength always protected the innocent. This simplicity wasn't naivety, it was necessity. A culture drowning in complexity and fear needed someone to make things simple again, to restore the feeling that right and wrong were distinguishable and that good men could make a difference. Then the 1960s arrived, and everything traditional came under attack. Civil rights movements challenged racial hierarchy. Feminism challenged gender roles. Anti-war movements challenged American military intervention. The counterculture challenged every assumption about authority, morality, and tradition. And John Wayne became the last symbol of how things used to be, the final patriarch standing against cultural chaos. His films in this era became explicitly political, defending traditional values against what he saw as civilizational collapse. He made The Green Berets in 1968 as direct pro-war propaganda when the rest of Hollywood had turned against Vietnam. The film was a commercial and critical disaster, and that failure marked the beginning of the end for the archetype he represented. But the real story of this archetype isn't just about John Wayne the actor. It's about Marion Morrison the man, and the gap between the myth and the reality reveals everything about why this energy worked and why it ultimately couldn't survive. Marion Morrison was born in 1907 in Iowa, a farm boy with nothing mythological about his origins. His father was a pharmacist who failed at farming. The family moved to California when Marion was young. Nothing in his background suggested he would become an icon. He played college football at USC, got injured, lost his scholarship, and started working as a prop man in Hollywood studios just to make rent. Director Raoul Walsh saw him moving furniture one day and thought he looked the part for a Western he was casting. He gave Marion the lead role in The Big Trail in 1930 and changed his name to John Wayne. The film flopped massively. Wayne spent the entire 1930s making B-Westerns, Poverty Row productions, over 60 forgettable films in 9 years. The myth hadn't formed yet because the formula hadn't been discovered. The perfect combination of character, camera presence, and cultural need hadn't aligned. The breakthrough came in 1939 when director John Ford cast Wayne in Stagecoach, a major production that gave him the character template that would define the next 40 years. Ringo Kid, an outlaw with a code, a man capable of violence but governed by internal morality, someone who protected the weak and punished the wicked not because society told him to, but because his own sense of justice demanded it. This was the archetype, and once it was established, Wayne never deviated from it again. But the man behind the myth carried contradictions that would haunt him his entire life. When Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, Wayne was 34 years old, prime fighting age, and he watched his contemporaries enlist while he stayed in Hollywood. He applied for the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, and was rejected. He never served a single day in the military. While Jimmy Stewart flew bombing missions over Germany, Clark Gable enlisted as a gunner, and Henry Fonda served in the Navy. Wayne stayed behind making war films, playing the heroes that other men were actually being. He later admitted that his failure to serve haunted him for the rest of his life, that he overcompensated through hyper-patriotic films and increasingly right-wing politics, that he became more military than actual veterans in an attempt to fill the void where real service should have been. The myth was built on exactly what the man lacked, and that gap between image and reality should have destroyed him, but instead made the myth more necessary. People needed to believe in the hero more than they needed the hero to be real. His personal life contradicted the patriarch archetype he played on screen. He married 5 times, had multiple affairs, fathered children from different relationships. The protector and provider on screen was a serial monogamist in real life who couldn't maintain the family stability that his characters always defended. He was a heavy alcoholic for most of his adult life, not unusual for Hollywood but completely incompatible with the steady, unshakable hero that audiences saw on screen. The man who never lost his composure in films drank himself to sleep most nights. And his politics in the 1960s and 70s became increasingly strident as the culture shifted away from everything he represented. He supported the Vietnam War loudly, while younger Americans protested it. He made statements about race and American history that were mainstream in 1950 but retrograde by 1971, when a Playboy interview revealed views that shocked a generation that had grown up watching his films. The myth couldn't adapt because adaptation would have destroyed it. John Wayne the idea required absolute moral certainty, and moral certainty cannot bend to accommodate cultural change. Yet despite all these contradictions, despite the gap between the man and the myth, the archetype worked. It worked so powerfully that when UCLA researchers showed his photograph to 2,000 people in 1978 and asked who they would follow into battle, he won by a margin so overwhelming it seemed impossible. And when researchers told half the participants that he had never served in combat, that every uniform he wore was costume, and every battle he fought was choreographed, the responses barely changed. People said they would still follow him, because what he represented mattered more than what he actually was. The myth had become more real than reality, more trusted than truth. And that reveals something profound about human psychology that we still struggle to accept. We don't want our heroes to be complex or flawed or human. We want them to be archetypal, to embody ideals that we can orient our lives around. John Wayne gave America that archetype for half a century, and the fact that he was performing it rather than living it didn't diminish its power because the performance was perfect. He never broke character in public. He gave interviews in character, walked in character, existed in character whenever cameras were near. The line between actor and role disappeared so completely that even he seemed to forget where Marion Morrison ended and John Wayne began. And the timing was perfect. America needed exactly this myth at exactly this moment in history. Post-Depression anxiety, post-war trauma, Cold War fear, cultural revolution, all of it created a desperate hunger for someone who represented certainty when everything else was uncertain, strength when everything else felt weak, moral clarity when everything else had become hopelessly complex. John Wayne offered that certainty, and millions of Americans chose to believe in it even when they knew intellectually that it was constructed, because the alternative was a world without heroes, without archetypes, without any template for what masculine strength was supposed to look like. And that world felt more terrifying than any fiction.